Welcome to True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat and every scar tells a truth. Thank you for watching True Wild West Love Stories, where every legend hides a heartbeat. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And tell us in the comments, do you believe redemption still exists in a world like this? The sun had barely lifted itself above the dusty horizon when the peace of the valley shattered under the frantic pounding of hooves. Morning mist still clung to the slow, rolling hills of Cedar Mesa, and the Colorado River shimmered like a ribbon of steel cutting through the wilderness. It was a quiet stretch of the West where days usually slipped by in predictable rhythms, cattle grazing, wind whispering through juniper trees, and riders drifting across the plains as though they were part of the land itself. But that morning carried something different in its bones. It was the kind of morning when fate stirred from its slumber. Elias Mercer had come west to outrun memories that no man should have to carry. Once a soldier, then a drifter, he had grown used to silence, to keeping his own company, to finding comfort in the steady beat of hooves beneath him. He kept mostly to himself, never staying long in one town, never close enough to anyone to leave a trace. Cedar Mesa was supposed to be just another stop, one night beside the river, one morning tending his horse, and then gone again. He had no plans, no ties, nothing but the worn saddle on his Mustang and the ghosts that followed him in the quiet hours. As he led his horse along the riverbank, searching for a place to water him, a faint sound drifted on the wind, an echo of something sharp, something panicked. He paused, head lifting, breath catching in the dry air. At first, he thought it might be a wild animal distressed in the brush. But then he heard it again, muffled, choked, rising and falling with a desperation that cut through him like a blade. His heart kicked hard in his chest as he tied off his horse and pushed toward the sound. The river, usually calm at that bend, churned in an angry boil. Spring meltwater from the mountains had swelled its belly, turning familiar shallows into dangerous currents. And in the middle of that roiling chaos, he saw a small figure being dragged under. A child no more than 10, struggling, flailing, vanishing beneath the surface, only to reappear farther down the current. The boy's tiny hands clawed at nothing, his mouth opening in a silent scream, swallowed by the roar of the river. Elias didn't think. He didn't weigh the risks or consider his past or future. Instinct surged through him like lightning, and he ran, boots thundering against the earth. The riverbank crumbled under his feet as he threw himself into the freezing water. The shock stole his breath, but he fought through it, diving under the current, letting it carry him closer to where the child struggled. The rapid pulled at him with vicious strength, dragging him downstream, spinning him, smashing him against submerged rocks. But he pushed forward, lungs burning, muscles screaming. He caught the boy on the third desperate reach. The child was limp, his energy spent, his head dipping beneath the surface again. Elias wrapped an arm around him, dragging him up, forcing both their heads above water as he kicked hard toward the opposite bank. The river pummeled him from all sides, spinning him in circles, clawing at the boy as if it meant to take him back. At one point, they vanished entirely beneath the surface, the world turning into a dark blur of icy water and roaring noise. But Elias held on. When he finally collapsed on the opposite shore, coughing up river water, the boy lay beside him, unmoving but breathing. Elias turned him on his side, clearing his lungs, feeling the faint rise of breath against his palm. Relief washed through him, not gentle, but overwhelming, like a storm breaking after long drought. He hadn't realized how badly his own hands were shaking until he tried to lift the child. A distant rumble of hooves echoed across the mesa. Elias looked up. A group of riders thundered toward him, dust rising behind them in a golden plume. They rode with the confidence and unity of people who belonged to the land, deep-rooted, unshakable. At their head rode a woman whose presence stole the breath right out of him. Tall in the saddle, fierce in posture, she carried herself with the authority of a leader and the calm of someone shaped by hardship and heritage. Her long dark hair was braided with leather and beads, her clothing a blend of rancher practicality and ancestral tradition. As she dismounted and rushed past Elias to gather the boy into her arms, he understood without needing to be told. This child was hers. Her riders circled protectively, each one watching him with unreadable eyes. The air shifted, thick with tension and unspoken rules. Though no words passed between them, Elias felt the weight of their gaze, the silent judgment, the shock of what had almost been lost. He had intruded on something sacred, something bound by cultural threads older than the territory itself. The woman held her child close, inspecting him with trembling hands before lifting her gaze to Elias. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind, more like someone evaluating a man's soul rather than his actions. Something ancient, something instinctive, flickered across her face, something Elias didn't yet understand. Before he could catch his breath, before he could even think to gather his belongings and ride away, the riders arranged themselves in a peculiar formation around him. Their horses shifted in deliberate steps, creating a loose circle, an enclosure, not aggressive, but ceremonial. Elias sensed it immediately. This wasn't a simple thank you gathering. This was something older, something deeper. The woman rose, still holding her child against her. She stepped toward Elias with a gravity that felt like the earth itself moving beneath his feet. A hush fell over the riders, and even the wind seemed to still, as though the land recognized what was about to be done. He felt it, a shift, a crossing of paths, a boundary breaking. Though she didn't speak, her actions were decisive. She placed her hand on his chest, just above his heart, and pressed her forehead briefly to his, a gesture filled with meaning that he couldn't name. The riders murmured in recognition. Elias felt the warmth of her touch, the softness of her breath, the certainty pulsing through her as though a decision had already been made long before this moment. Something irrevocable had just occurred. The child stirred weakly in her arms but clung to her clothing, his small fingers trembling. She held him close again, then looked back at Elias with a steady resolve. He didn't need words to understand that, in her world, saving a life, especially that of a child, carried consequences and obligations. The way her people watched him shifted from suspicion to acknowledgement, not friendly, not hostile, but accepting, as though fate had just delivered him into a role he hadn't chosen. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist. The river behind him continued roaring. And in that suspended moment, Elias Mercer, drifter, loner, a man who belonged nowhere, realized he had just stepped into the middle of an ancestral law he knew nothing about. A law that bound life to life, destiny to destiny. A law that would soon reshape his entire future. A law that declared him the husband of the woman whose child he had saved. As the riders lifted the child and prepared to escort him home, the woman gestured for Elias to follow. The path ahead was not clear, but she expected him to walk it. He hesitated only once, before crossing the boundary of the rider's circle and stepping into a life he never saw coming. The real story was only beginning. The wind shifted as Elias Mercer followed the riders across the broad sweep of Cedar Mesa, the smell of damp earth and river silt clinging to him like a second skin. His clothes still bore the heavy weight of the river's fury, and every muscle in his body ached from the struggle to keep the child alive. His boots pressed into unfamiliar soil, and though no one had spoken a single word to him, the expectations of an entire community rode at his back like a silent shadow. The woman, the leader, the mother, the one whose quiet authority commanded even the wind, rode ahead with her child held protectively before her. The boy's breathing had steadied, but the imprint of fear had not yet faded from his small face. The riders flanking her guarded them with vigilance, forming a shifting barrier of horses and presence that kept Elias carefully contained within their formation. It was not imprisonment but ceremony, a rite walking itself out upon the land. The trail carried them away from the Colorado River and deeper into the rolling elevations where red cliffs rose like ancient sentinels. Sagebrush whispered against their boots, and the sky spread wide overhead, a limitless canvas of sun, washed blue. Elias had roamed the West long enough to know, when he was stepping onto hallowed ground, the land breathed differently here, as though every stone and tree carried memory. He sensed the weight of tradition, a lineage older than his own country's borders, carved into the very bones of the mesa. The riders did not hurry, but their pace had purpose. They guided him through a valley that opened like a cradle between two ridges, revealing a settlement nestled in natural protection. Homes built from timber and earth rose in careful harmony with the land, their shapes blending with the colors of the surrounding hills. Smoke curled upward from central fire pits, and the scent of roasting meat drifted faintly on the breeze. It was a place shaped by both necessity and pride, a community too resilient to be conquered by time or hardship. As they approached, figures emerged from the dwellings, gathering in small clusters to watch their arrival. Women paused in their weaving, men set aside tools, children ran toward their parents for reassurance. All eyes settled on the returning group, and then, inevitably, upon Elias. He stood out even without trying, a man washed up by the river, a stranger wearing the weariness of old battles and the uncertainty of new ones. The people did not greet him with hostility, nor with hospitality. Instead, they regarded him with the careful study of those measuring the significance of an unexpected shift in destiny. They saw more than the man. They saw the act that brought him here. One child's life had been plucked from the river's jaws. Such an act could not exist without consequence. The woman who had led the riders, the mother whose presence had already begun to imprint itself upon his awareness, dismounted with fluid skill. She stood tall, her posture unshaken despite the fear she had endured moments earlier. In her eyes rested gratitude, but also something deeper, rooted in tradition older than the settlement itself. She carried her son to a central lodge built from sturdy timbers and painted hides. Several elders stepped forward, their faces creased with decades of sun and wisdom. They examined the boy, their practiced hands moving with certainty as they checked his breathing, his heartbeat, his awareness. They nodded among themselves, relief flowing through the watching crowd like an exhalation. But their attention soon drifted to Elias. Though still, wordless, he felt the full force of their scrutiny. They saw him not merely as a drifter or a stranger, but as a man who had crossed a threshold between worlds. A man who had unknowingly stepped into the embrace of their ancestral law. The woman stood beside the elders, her head held high, her expression neither soft nor stern, but resolute. She placed a hand on her son's back, steadying him as he attempted to stand on his own. The villagers watched with reverence. They knew what came next, even if Elias did not. The elders motioned toward him, not with a command, but with the kind of gesture reserved for inevitable truths. He understood the message instinctively. He stepped forward. A sense of ceremony unfurled around him, silent yet powerful. Elders, riders, and villagers formed a loose circle, mirroring the shape created earlier by the riverbank. The wind stilled again, as though nature herself witnessed the moment. The woman stepped into the center with Elias, her son at her side. The ancestors' law hung over the gathering like an invisible shroud. Elias did not know the words, the rituals, or the customs, but he could feel meaning settle upon him with the weight of a brand. He sensed the recognition in the villagers' eyes, not of a mere guest or hero, but of someone now tied to their people through unbreakable bonds. The law was clear to them. A man who saved the life of a child, especially one who carried the bloodline of leadership, owed a debt not of currency or service but of kinship. Their ancestors had formed this law generations ago, in a time when survival depended upon unity, when the loss of one life endangered the whole. The life, Savor was bound to the saved child's family, not as a servant but as part of their lineage, to protect, to belong, to stand as kin, and if the mother of the child held no husband, he became hers. Not by choice, but by fate woven through the land. Elias sensed it now. The woman's presence beside him carried a quiet acceptance, a burden carried with dignity. Her people watched her with respect, but not surprise. She had been widowed years earlier. Fate had chosen a new path for her, and she stepped into it without hesitation. He realized then that her earlier gesture, the touch to his chest, the press of her forehead, had been part of a sacred acknowledgement, a recognition of the bond now forged between them. The elders raised their hands to the sky in silent invocation. Elias felt the solemnity deepen, connecting him to a story that began long before he was born. He had lived most of his life drifting, unclaimed by any land or home. Now this place claimed him with a force he did not know how to resist. When the ceremony ended, the villagers dispersed, leaving only the riders, elders, and the woman with her son. She turned toward her dwelling, a large lodge covered in intricate hide patterns, and walked with measured steps. Her son followed closely, casting curious glances at the man who had become intertwined with their lives. She paused at the entrance and looked back at Elias, not commanding him, but acknowledging the path now laid before them. The message was unmistakable. His life of wandering had ended. His duty, his future, and perhaps even his heart now rested within this settlement, beside the woman whose name he did not yet know. He crossed the threshold into her home, into her world, stepping into a fate he had saved without understanding. Beyond the horizon, clouds gathered, promising a storm. The land itself seemed to shift, preparing for more changes yet to come. The foundation of their union had been set, but the real test had not yet revealed itself. The interior of the woman's lodge held a quiet stillness that contrasted sharply with the roaring river Elias had escaped only hours earlier. The air carried the faint scent of juniper smoke and crushed sage, as if the land itself lingered inside the walls. Soft light filtered through hides stretched across wooden frames, revealing a living space shaped by both necessity and tradition. Furs lay neatly along the ground, tools hung polished and ready, and handcrafted pottery lined the shelves with careful precision. Nothing inside felt wasted or forgotten. Every object seemed to hold history. Elias stood near the entrance, uncertain where his presence fit among the belongings of a family he had known less than half a day. His boots felt heavy on soil that belonged more to memory than to him. He was used to being a passing shadow in other people's stories, a stranger who left as quietly as he arrived. But now, without intention, He had stepped into a life that reached for him with invisible threads. The woman moved about her lodge with the familiarity of someone who had rebuilt her life from pieces more than once. She tended to her recovering child with care, laying him upon soft blankets and covering him with a warm hide. The boy drifted into an exhausted sleep almost immediately, the ordeal etched faintly on his young features. His breathing steadied, rising and falling in gentle rhythm. The mother checked him repeatedly, her fingers brushing over him with protective certainty. Elias watched from a respectful distance, sensing the unspoken bond between them, a bond he had unintentionally tied himself into by dragging the child from the river's grasp. Outside, the settlement shifted into its afternoon rhythms. The sound of axes splitting wood echoed alongside the distant laughter of children who had returned to their chores once they were sure the rescued boy would live. Women sorted herbs and tended fires. Men prepared horses for the coming evening ride. The community flowed around Elias like a river, moving around a stone, acknowledging him without overt attention, accepting his presence even if they had not yet welcomed him. He felt like an echo of himself, suspended between the man he had been and the man this place now required him to be. The elders remained near the lodge entrance for a long time, observing. Their faces held the same stern wisdom as the land, untouched by haste, carved by seasons. They exchanged glances among themselves, not needing to speak to interpret the unspoken law that had unfolded. To them, fate was a circle, not a line. A man who stepped into its path did not step back out unchanged. They eventually dispersed, leaving Elias alone with the woman and her child. She did not usher him deeper into the dwelling, nor gesture for him to leave. Instead, she continued her quiet tasks, her movements deliberate, almost meditative. She sorted dried plants, arranged supplies, and set a small fire in the center pit to bring warmth into the room. Elias sensed her strength not through force, but through calm command, a woman who had endured challenges and shaped her life around them rather than yielding. As the firelight flickered, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle into his bones. He had spent years wandering across barren plains and war-worn towns, never staying long enough to let a place become familiar. Yet here, in this lodge of a woman whose name he still did not know, something inside him stilled. The weight of the union forced by ancestral law lingered between them, yet it did not feel hostile or uncomfortable. Instead, it carried a solemn inevitability, like the moment before a storm when the air holds its breath. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall. Drops pattered on the roof with soft, rhythmic insistence. The sky had darkened, filled with clouds that swallowed the afternoon light. Elias stepped closer to the lodge wall and listened to the rain, allowing memories of battles and deserts and solitary nights to fall away with it. The storm felt like a cleansing, as though the land washed away fragments of the past to make room for what was coming. The woman's child stirred, shifting under his blankets. She immediately moved to comfort him, brushing her fingers across his forehead in a motion filled with tenderness. Elias observed the quiet strength she carried in every gesture, the kind of strength forged not from physical might, but from endurance, leadership, and an unspoken promise to protect her people. He wondered how long she had led her community alone, how many burdens she had carried without complaint, how many nights she had sat awake tending to her people's needs while the weight of widowhood pressed against her heart. He felt respect for her rise within him like a slow, burning fire. When she finally looked at him, her gaze carried neither fear nor expectation. Instead, it held acknowledgment, acceptance of what fate had carved between them. She did not treat him as a stranger, nor as a husband. She looked at him as a man who had entered her life through an act of courage, and now stood at a crossroads with her. The rain fell harder, drumming a steady rhythm across the mesa. Elias stepped toward the fire to warm his hands. The flames cast shifting patterns across the lodge walls, illuminating the woman's face as she tucked another hide around her son. She seemed carved from the land itself, strong, unyielding, fiercely loyal. He felt a subtle pull in his chest, a thread connecting him to her, even though no words had passed between them. It wasn't affection, not yet, but something more primal, more instinctual, a recognition, a seed planted by the law of her ancestors and watered by the river that had nearly taken her child. As evening settled, riders approached the lodge. The rhythmic sound of hooves vibrated through the ground, followed by the rustle of hides as they sought entry. Several women arrived with baskets of food and supplies, offering what the community believed essential for a new union, gifts of respect, acknowledgement of fate's hand. They placed these offerings near the lodge entrance, bowing their heads in silent unity before departing. Elias understood. In the eyes of these people, the union had already begun. The storm outside intensified. Thunder rolled across the cliffs like an echo of ancient voices. The sky cracked with flashes of light, illuminating the mesa in brief, breathtaking brilliance. The world outside grew wild and unpredictable, but inside the lodge, the fire created warmth and safety. Night deepened, bringing with it the chill of the storm. The woman set out blankets near the far wall, creating a separate space for Elias. Her actions drew boundaries without hostility. She was not forcing closeness, nor demanding distance. She was creating a place for him in her home, a quiet, respectful gesture stamped with acceptance. He nodded silently to himself and settled onto the blankets. His mind wandered through the events of the day, through the river, the ceremony, and the fate now entwined with the lives of two people he had not known that morning. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally claimed him, it came with surprising ease. For the first time in years, he did not dream of battles or loss. He dreamed of water, wind, and the steady presence of a woman who faced storms without fear. Outside, the storm raged long into the night, unaware that within the dim glow of a solitary fire, destinies had begun to shape themselves into something unbreakable. The storm would soon pass, but the next challenge was already gathering on the horizon. Morning rose slowly over Cedar Mesa, spreading gold across the storm-washed land. The night's thunder had rumbled away into distant silence, leaving the air crisp and sharpened with the scent of wet earth. When Elias stepped outside the lodge that had sheltered him, he felt the world shift beneath him, as if acknowledging his presence in a way it hadn't the day before. The settlement stirred with early motion, the bleating of goats, the clatter of tools, the creak of saddles being tightened. Life resumed, steady and purposeful. Yet, for Elias, this morning carried a different weight. The river had chosen his path. The ancestors' law had sealed it, and now the community looked toward him not as a stranger, but as a man bound by a promise older than memory. The woman to whom fate had tied him emerged shortly after. Her child, recovered enough to walk, clung to her side with lingering frailty. The boy's steps were hesitant, still weakened by the ordeal, yet he carried himself with youthful determination. The mother moved with quiet pride, her braid trailing down her back, her expression calm but alert. Elias sensed that she prepared herself for something significant, something expected the moment a new husband entered her life. The villagers gathered in small groups, glancing toward the central clearing where the elders stood in patient formation. The air felt charged, as though the land waited for the next page to turn. Without needing to be told, Elias understood that this day held meaning. A test, perhaps, a ritual, a measure of the man now tied to their leader and her child. The elders raised their staffs, indicating for the village to assemble. People stepped forward respectfully, forming a loose circle around the central fire pit. The woman joined the elders, her son standing close to her, his small hand resting against her leg. Their presence at the center of the gathering anchored the moment with gravity. Elias approached slowly, his boots pressing into the damp soil. He felt eyes track him from every corner of the circle, watchful, cautious, expectant. This was not judgment, it was evaluation. Their customs were built from necessity. A husband, especially one chosen by fate rather than intention, had obligations to fulfill. Protection, provision, loyalty, these were not ceremonial ideals, but requirements for survival. The elders stepped forward, gesturing toward him with solemn intent. Though no words were spoken aloud, their meaning washed through the crowd with clarity. The community needed to see the measure of the man who would stand beside their leader, who would help raise the boy he saved, who would walk the path of kin through action, not ceremony alone. Tests among these people were not theatrical displays. They were rooted in the land itself, in tasks shaped by daily life and the harsh demands of the West. Elias was led toward the open plains beyond the settlement, accompanied by several riders who moved with silent authority. The land stretched wide before them, alive with tall grass and distant shadows where wild horses grazed. Herding, tracking, protection, these skills were essential here, where danger and survival walked side by side. The riders gestured toward a cluster of wild horses roaming free near the ridge. These were not simple ranch animals. They were spirited creatures tied to the people's identity. To guide one, successfully, was to prove oneself capable of navigating both the land and its challenges. Elias understood that he must catch one. He breathed slowly, focusing not on the crowd watching from afar, nor on the weight of ancestral law pressing against his back, but on the horse before him. A chestnut mare, strong and alert, lifted her head at his approach. She watched him with intelligent eyes, measuring his intentions. Elias had worked with horses his entire life. He respected them as creatures of instinct and power. But he also knew that forcing one to yield would only spark resistance. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, letting the mare sense him, smell him, understand his patience. The wind shifted, she snorted, pawed the earth, and bolted toward the open plains. Elias ran. The chase burned through him with fierce momentum. His legs hammered against the ground, his breath tearing from his lungs, sweat gathering despite the morning chill. The mare darted across the ridge, testing his endurance, but he did not falter. His past, every battle fought, every mile ridden, every night spent under uncertain skies, had carved strength into him. Step by step, he closed the distance. When he finally reached her, he moved in fluid instinct, looping a rope around her neck with practiced skill. The mare reared back, wild and thrashing, but he held firm, guiding her with a calm persistence that spoke of years spent surviving by grit alone. His muscles trembled from strain, yet his resolve anchored him. Gradually, the mare's resistance softened into reluctant acceptance. The watching villagers murmured among themselves. Approval shifted through them like wind through tall grass. Elias led the mare back toward the settlement, her head lowered, her steps steady. The riders flanked him, their expressions unreadable but no longer as guarded. When he reached the central clearing, the elders nodded. Their acknowledgment was simple but powerful. He had met the first expectation placed upon him. But the day was far from over. The next test came in the form of danger, not from nature, but from the world beyond their settlement. Smoke drifted from the northern plains, faint but unmistakable. Scouts arrived from the ridge, their faces sharp with tension. They signaled toward the distant line of hills where a rival group had been spotted days earlier. Conflict had been brewing between the groups for months. The rivals were opportunistic riders who moved between territories, taking what they could, forcing smaller communities into uneasy negotiations. Their appearance near Cedar Mesa's borders meant trouble that could arrive in hours. The villagers stiffened with unease. The woman who was now bound to Elias stood firm, her posture that of a leader prepared to defend her people. She directed her riders with quick precision, setting protective patrols around the perimeter, reinforcing watch points, preparing weapons and provisions. Elias felt the atmosphere shift. The villagers had accepted him through ceremony and trial, but now came the true test, whether he would stand with them when danger approached, whether he would defend the woman and child whose lives were now tied to his own, whether he would be more than a passerby. He watched the horizon where the smoke rose, thin and ominous. The land around him pulsed with urgency, with the tension of impending threat. The villagers moved around him with purpose, but their glances now carried something different: hope. They hoped he would be the man fate had chosen. As evening settled, the scouts returned with more troubling news. The rival group had grown in number. They were riding closer. The settlement went quiet. The woman stood near the entrance of her lodge, her son at her side. The fading light illuminated her steady expression, unshaken by fear. Elias felt something anchor inside him, a sense of belonging that rose from loyalty rather than obligation. He stepped toward her, not as a stranger, not as a man forced by law, but as someone prepared to stand beside her in whatever storm approached. The night crept across the land, drawing shadows over Cedar Mesa. Fires burned low, watch riders patrolled the outskirts, and the tension of the coming threat tightened around the village like an unseen hand. Elias knew the next dawn would demand more of him than any test the elders had prepared. The storm he would face now would not come from the sky, but from men. The days that followed the raid felt strangely suspended, as if the entire valley was holding its breath. The smoke had cleared, the wounded had been tended to, and the raiders had vanished back into the canyon trails they used like shadows. Yet the echoes of danger lingered with an almost physical presence. It was in the careful way the tribe moved, the way the women gathered closer together, and the way the men kept their rifles within arm's reach, even while doing the smallest tasks. Elias felt the shift more keenly than most. He had always believed the West to be a land of clean horizons and simple tests of survival, but the events of the past days had shown him how layered life truly was here, how much history lay beneath every decision, every custom, every whispered reminder of the ancestors watching from beyond the veil. Leora remained by her son's side often, keeping him close as if afraid the world might snatch him away again. She had shifted into a quieter rhythm, moving with a kind of watchful determination, though Elias sensed she carried something else, something heavier. Her gratefulness toward him lingered, but it now came mixed with uncertainty, as though she stood at the edge of a choice that would shape everything that came after. The tribe, meanwhile, had begun to speak. Elias did not need to hear every word to understand the general direction of their thoughts. He could see it in the glances they exchanged, in the way the elders spoke near the great fire when they assumed he was too far to hear. The old law had been invoked the day he pulled Leora's son from the river. That law was clear. If a man saved a mother's child, the man became bound to her as husband, protector, and partner. The ancestors were said to mark such moments, shaping fate with invisible hands that humans dared not contradict. But the attack had disrupted everything. It had delayed the elders' rituals, shifted their priorities, and left uncertainty in every corner of the valley. And though the raiders were gone, everyone knew their return was only a matter of time. Nothing was ever settled so easily in the West. Elias spent most mornings repairing tools and fences damaged during the raid. The work steadied him. It reminded him that, for all the wildness of the land and the weight of ancient laws, there were still tasks that required simple hands and straightforward strength. Yet even as he worked, his thoughts drifted repeatedly to Leora, and to the strange, unbreakable bond the ancestors' law claimed existed between them. He had never imagined himself in such a position. He had not come here seeking a family or permanence or destiny. He had come seeking space, and perhaps a chance to outrun memories that clung too tightly. But fate, it seemed, had its own sense of humor. It had thrown him straight into a world where tradition was carved into the bones of the people who lived by it. That afternoon, the elders summoned him for the first time since the raid. Elias approached the circle with quiet respect, feeling the weight of their ageless gazes settle upon him. They motioned for him to sit near the fire while they studied him in silence. The moments stretched, heavy with meaning, though not a single word was spoken aloud. At last, the eldest among them, her hair long and white as frost on prairie grass, placed a weathered hand upon the carved staff beside her. The movement alone seemed to speak volumes. Though no words left her lips, her intention was unmistakable. The ancestors' law could wait no longer. The tribe could not exist in limbo indefinitely. Fate had already spoken on the riverbank. Now the living must honor what the dead had decreed. When Elias left the circle, night had fallen across the valley. Torches flickered around the huts, and the cool wind carried the scent of distant rain. He knew what the elders intended to declare the next morning. The ceremony would be set, the bond would be formalized, the tribe would expect him to stand beside Leora, not as an outsider offering help, but as the man chosen by the oldest law known to them. Yet his heart was troubled, not by the tribe's traditions, but by something far more complex. He cared for Leora, yes, more than he had realized until recently. But he also knew she had her own fears, her own wounds, her own grief over a life disrupted by raiders and hardship. What if his presence complicated things further? What if she felt bound only by obligation, not desire? Later that night, Elias found himself walking toward the river without meaning to. The moon glowed across the water in pale streaks, the same water that had nearly taken a young boy's life. He stared at the currents for a long time, listening to the whispers of the valley, feeling the weight of decisions pressing down like a saddle loaded with too heavy a burden. Behind him, the sound of footsteps approached slowly. Elias did not turn immediately. He knew who it would be even before she stepped into the moonlight. Leora stopped beside him, her expression unreadable, her presence quiet yet powerful in its simplicity. She seemed to carry the entire weight of tradition on her shoulders, as though she too had been summoned by the ancestors to face the crossroads ahead. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood by the river that had bound their fates together in ways neither had expected. The wind stirred around them, carrying the sound of distant drums as the tribe prepared for morning. Leora finally lowered her gaze toward the water, the moonlight reflecting in her eyes like shards of silver. Though she said nothing, Elias understood the question she carried, the same question he had wrestled with since the elders called him. Were they ready to accept the bond the ancestors demanded? The night deepened around them, leaving the answer suspended in the silence between two hearts standing on the edge of fate. And as dawn approached, the valley braced for the moment when destiny would either bind them or break them forever. The first light of dawn crept over the valley in muted shades of rose and gold, brushing gently across the earth as if the morning itself understood the significance of the day. A stillness settled over the land, deeper than silence, filled not with fear, but with anticipation. The air carried a faint bite of coolness, a reminder that change often came with the chill of new beginnings. Elias rose before the sun, though sleep had barely touched him. His thoughts had churned endlessly throughout the night, moving between memories of the river, the weight of the ancestors' law, and the quiet, unreadable expression on Leora's face as the moon reflected off the water. Every part of him knew the decision he made today would shape not only his life but hers, and her son's, forever. As he stepped out of his shelter, he saw the tribe already gathering in slow, reverent movements. The elders had begun preparing the ceremonial grounds, marking the earth with symbols older than any living memory. The younger men arranged stones in spirals, while the women placed carved wooden totems at each corner of the sacred circle. It was a ritual that had been carried out for generations, binding destinies, sealing promises, and honoring the will of those who came before. Leora stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the preparations with a distant expression. Her son clung to her hand, unaware of the deeper meaning behind the day's events, sensing only the peculiar hush that had fallen across the tribe. She wore garments reserved for sacred ceremonies, garments adorned with patterns that told the story of her lineage, a lineage carved into the valley long before the first settlers arrived. Elias felt an unexpected pang of awe when he saw her. Something in the sight of her, standing tall despite the storm that had reshaped her life, touched a part of him that had remained untouched for years. It was the kind of quiet strength that could anchor a drifting soul, pulling it toward a sense of home it never believed existed. Yet the question still lingered heavily within him. Was he stepping into this ceremony because of fate, or because he feared defying it? Was his heart guiding him, or was he simply following the path carved by ancient rule? He had survived many trials in the West, but none had ever required him to weigh the future of another person so closely against his own. The tribe assembled around the sacred circle as the sun finally crested the ridge. Its rays struck the valley with a brilliance that made the carvings on the ceremonial stones shimmer as if lit from within. The elders entered last, moving with slow, deliberate steps, their garments whispering against the earth. They carried staffs adorned with feathers and beads, symbols of the old spirits who endured in the shadows of the land. Elias approached the circle when summoned, each footstep heavy with meaning. He felt the eyes of the tribe on him, not with judgment, but with expectation. They saw him as the man who saved a child's life. They saw him as the one chosen by the river and guided by the unseen hands of their ancestors. And though he still felt like an outsider in many ways, the tribe regarded him now with a reverence he had never encountered before. Leora stepped forward shortly after, leaving her son in the care of a nearby elder. Her movements were graceful, though Elias sensed the nerves hidden beneath her calm exterior. She carried her own questions, her own hopes, her own fears. She had not sought this fate any more than he had, yet she had accepted the possibility with a dignity that humbled him. As she entered the circle, the tribe began the low, rhythmic chant reserved for moments when earthly decisions intertwined with spiritual bonds. The sound rolled across the clearing in waves, ancient and unwavering, as though the valley itself had begun to hum in recognition of what was to unfold. The elders lifted their staffs and traced symbols in the air, gestures meant to call upon the spirits to observe and bless the moment. In the center of the circle, Elias and Leora stood facing one another. No words passed between them, but the silence carried its own significance. It held the weight of shared danger, of gratitude, of sacrifice, and of a bond forged not through choice, but through destiny. The river had tied their fates together, but the ceremony would seal that tie in the eyes of the tribe and the spirits alike. The eldest among the elders stepped closer, raising her staff high. Her movements were slow, deliberate, carried by the weight of countless generations. Though she did not speak aloud, her gestures conveyed the final question, the question that lay beneath every tradition, no matter how ancient. Would they accept the bond? Elias closed his eyes briefly, feeling the prickling of the morning wind across his skin. He thought of the boy he had saved, of the relief in Leora's eyes when she held her son again, of the fire that had raged when raiders attacked, of the way the tribe rallied to defend one another. He thought of the countless moments since then, moments of shared glances, unspoken understanding, and a sense of belonging he had never expected to find in the rugged expanse of the West. And as he opened his eyes, he realized the truth that had quietly settled within him. He did not fear the bond. He welcomed it. For the first time in a long while, he felt the possibility of a life rooted not in wandering, but in purpose. A life built not on running from the past, but on shaping the future. Leora lifted her gaze, meeting his with a calm steadiness. In her eyes he saw no reluctance, no dread, only the quiet resolve of a woman who understood the path laid before her, and had chosen to walk it willingly. The moment stretched between them, filled with meaning deeper than words. Elias bowed his head in acceptance. Leora followed, and with that simple gesture, the elders lowered their staffs, signaling that the bond had been accepted. The tribe erupted into chants of celebration, their voices rising into the clear morning sky, echoing across the valley like the triumphant call of ancient spirits. The children ran between the huts with bright laughter. The women prepared offerings, and the men lit fires that sent spirals of smoke upward as a blessing. Elias felt a wave of warmth wash over him, relief, belonging, and something far gentler, something that felt almost like hope. Leora stepped beside him, her presence steady and peaceful, and together they received the blessings of the tribe. Her son soon rushed into her arms and clung to her, then turned to look up at Elias with bright, unclouded eyes, as though accepting him instantly. As the sun climbed higher and the valley filled with celebration, Elias realized that fate had not bound him to a life he feared. It had brought him to a life he had unknowingly sought all along. The valley, once a place of uncertainty, now felt like home. And as he stood surrounded by a tribe that had embraced him, by a woman who had accepted him, and by a child whose life had changed his own, Elias understood that the West was not just a land of wandering spirits and drifting men. It was also a land where destiny waited quietly in unexpected places. And sometimes it waited in the form of a river, a child in danger, and a woman whose heart had been carved from the very spirit of the valley. The ceremony came to its gentle close as the chants faded into the afternoon breeze. The elders stepped back, the crowd slowly dispersed, and Elias found himself standing beneath the open sky, no longer a stranger, no longer an outsider, but a man whose fate had been sealed by courage, gratitude, and the ancient law of the ancestors. A new life had begun, and the West, with all its rugged beauty, stretched before him like a promise waiting to be lived.